Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to the MK Gallery and the Mellon for the opportunity to speak today. It's really exciting to be the first up. Possibly it's perverse to begin this conference with a paper titled Everyone But Stubbs. George Stubbs is probably the only animal painter of his time who most people will have heard of, so widely admired that he's often said to be more than an animal painter. The argument that Stubbs was too good to be thought of as working in the genre he self-evidently did work in is very revealing about our attitude to sporting and animal art. Its supposedly limited ambitions, mediocrity, and isolation from proper mainstream art. Partly this is because we know about the low place that animal painting held in the official hierarchy of genres in the Georgian period, so that an artist like Stubbs is known to have expressed regret at having established himself as a horse painter. But we should be wary of dismissing a now little-known group of artists whose work was undeniably popular and highly saleable purely on this basis. And without an understanding of these artists' work, lives, skills, and creativity, we cannot really understand animal painting and sporting art as an artistic genre, or its significance. What was the appeal or motivation for picturing animals? What was the pattern of these artists' working lives, their relationship with the animals they depicted? And how might this particular, specific trade inform our understanding of the human-animal relationship in this period? This paper doesn't attempt to answer all of these questions, but its outline of the population of artists working on sporting and animal subjects from 1760 to 1840 is intended to open up how we think about this somewhat neglected genre in a key period of British art. My interest in this question comes from my recent PhD on animal painting and sporting art, as Martin said, but it also reflects a wider impetus to challenge the canon of art history, of whose and what kind of work is said to be important, and how this skews our understanding of the actual practice and experience of the art and visual culture of the past. Stubbs, of course, is an important figure in the field, but he's only one figure, and I wanted to look at animal painters and their work across the genre, finding who was working in the field from first principles. So I decided I needed to do a population study. My initial expectation was that I'd amass a fairly small list of clearly identified animal painters from the period and be able to analyse the population in some detail. But this plan rapidly changed as it became clear how tricky it was to reach a satisfactory definition of animal painter. Any artist who advertised themselves or was discussed as such during their life could obviously be counted, and there are a number of artist dictionaries and trade directories which help. But it was soon clear that this would only provide a very patchy record. In search of other sources to open up my research, I started looking in earnest at a resource noted in Stephen Duker's seminal 1988 book, Sporting Art in England, namely the annual lists of sporting subjects exhibited in the Royal Academy, published from 1793 onwards in the Sporting magazine. Now, this is a very interesting resource because there's been very little attention to the relationship between sporting artists and the London exhibitions, despite the enormous importance and transformative influence that we know exhibitions had on British art in this period. The Sporting magazine's lists of exhibited sporting subjects are useful because they offer both explicit definitions and practical examples. And they're not necessarily what you might expect. In 1793, the magazine declared its intention to cover not only pictures of the chase, the stud and the races, but also, quote, the less elegant drudge of rural employ. In 1815, this had expanded yet further to any painting, quote, where any sporting subject or sporting animal has been accidentally or purposely made a part of the picture, end quote. That's quite a broad remit. Duker takes issue with this. He complains that the reviews don't function as lists of pictures directly concerned with sport itself, but the subjects include, quote, natural history, anything evidently to do with animals, and almost anything at all to do with the countryside, end quote. But this suggests that we have a better ability to judge what was considered sporting art than a contemporary specialist publication. What if we took these lists and definitions seriously? The picture they present is far broader than most modern attempts to define the field, including paintings of exotic creatures, landscape with cattle, comic and genre paintings, and even historical, religious, and allegorical works, such as, it's a personal favourite, it's Towne, isn't it? Yes, this is my first favourite, the painting Death on a Pale Horse by the history painter Benjamin West, which, as you can see, was listed in the Sporting Magazine in February 1817. Challenging. In constructing my survey, I not only took all the artists listed by the Sporting Magazine, but used its inclusive criteria as a guide to source other names directly from exhibition catalogues. So this certainly opened up my research from the familiar narratives, but it also led to a completely unworkable list of wildly disparate artists, from major specialists to those who only worked in the field in a very minor way. I then broke this long list down into 4 snapshot years, 1760, 1800, 1820, and 1840, and restricted these lists to artists who could be shown to have been working on relevant subjects in or around each year, in total identifying 691 individual artists. I'm showing the numbers for each year on this slide, and you can see how the population rockets over this period. By the time I'd reached this point, there was actually very little time to conduct the detailed sociological survey I'd originally planned, but I gathered information on the artists' working lives in a few key areas. And today I'm going to talk mostly about the locations in which these artists lived and worked, bringing in some of the other areas as they become relevant. I have to acknowledge a distinct limitation to this data in that due to those time constraints, I had to rely heavily on secondary biographical information about all the different places in which artists were living and working during their lives. What I did have, however, from looking at primary evidence, such as exhibition catalogues, was a substantial source of information about artists' contact with London. So I therefore asked 3 questions, counting those artists who had any sort of contact with cities and large towns, who had contact specifically with London, and who are not recorded as having any contact with urban centres, although, of course, we have to be careful about using negative evidence like that. I also, as with all my data, split my population each year into artists who were primarily animal or sporting specialists, Group A, and those who dipped in and out of these subjects while being better known for other genres, Group B. Group A, incidentally, was consistently around a third of the total, which is a significant statistic when thinking about the supposed isolation of animal painting from other genres. So what we can see here, expressed in percentages, is a remarkable result for London across both groups, from 79 to 100% of these artists having some contact with the city. Some skewing to London could certainly have been expected from my heavy use of metropolitan exhibition data, but these results are still surprising for a trade that is often portrayed as regional and oriented to country patrons. Of those who had contact with cities and large towns, regional artists, for example, who used urban bases to meet clients and market their works, the vast majority had also lived, worked, or exhibited in London. In comparison, very few had no contact with London or other cities, and few of them were actually born in London, as you can see from the extra line I've added on the slide. It's very likely, of course, that some obscure local artists who didn't sign their names are missing from this account, but given that I also include artists from specialist secondary sources, such as sporting art dictionaries, if there had been a substantial number of known artists who worked outside these urban networks, they would have been noted and captured in the survey. So what does this tell us? I think that if we look at this pattern alongside the considerable growth of the total population over the 80-year period, and the fact that for every specialist animal painter there were 1 or 2 artists better known for other genres who are working on very similar subjects, we can see that animal painting and sporting art was not a marginalised specialisation at this time, but actually quite well integrated with an art trade that was, in general, expanding and becoming more respectable and reliable as a career, as a result of the expanded market for art and the increased professional and social status that exhibitions and institutions like the RA brought. London represented the biggest marketplace, the greatest concentration of places to sell, work, meet with patrons, and network with other artists. We can see the difference in how the trade operated in London and elsewhere if we compare 2 directories from circa 1820. In Baines's Directory and Gazetteer for the County of York for 1822 to 23, 8 animal painters are listed across the whole county. In the directories printed in the London Journal, The Annals of the Fine Arts, between 1817 and 1820, however, this is far outnumbered by 32 self-declared animal specialists and 4 others, down here, listed under other genres, but whom we know worked on these subjects as well. All but 2 of these artists listed here are listed with London contact details, although they may not have actually lived there. There are also other hints at the practice of the trade. Going back to this, in Yorkshire, most of the artists are based in the larger urban centres, one animal painter to each, and all but Dalby and Schweinfelder are also listed as specialising in another genre. They're also nearly all fine artists, some of whom, like Herring, were very prominent names in their field. This suggests that there was a reasonably sustained market for animal paintings across the county, perhaps unsurprisingly given its importance as a centre for horse breeding and racing. An interesting exception to much of the above is George Bailey, listed at the top, whose practice is advertised in connection with the lower trades of house and sign painting, and who was based not in the city, but in the small town of Bawtry. Bailey had a distinctive background, however. He was, or he had been, a prize fighter and racehorse trainer, and he may have been able to exploit his connections to make animal painting a profitable sideline. Some horses, but also cows and landscape and other things, such as you can see. In London, meanwhile, there are some names that are still fairly well known today, including James Ward, who is known to have felt ambivalent, like Stubbs, about the label of animal painter, as you can see here reflected in his listing. I'll stop there. He mentions all the genres that he can paint for you. But he was actually an enormously successful and prolific exhibitor, and he had a long list of prestigious clients in big London house and gallery. Oh, I should show you Ward. Yes. A wonderful animal painter, James Ward. J.L. Agasse, Abraham Cooper, Edwin Landseer and Ben Marshall are also major figures in sporting art histories, but there are also much less familiar names listed here, advertising as animal specialists, such as the watercolourist and etcher Robert Hills. He was a prolific exhibitor and publisher of animal images on paper, and the now extremely obscure George Stevens, who was, however, an enormously active exhibitor specialising in animal subjects, showing at least 342 works in London over his lifetime. There's only one artist who advertised in both the directories I've shown, Charles Henry Schweinfelder of Leeds. And notably, he was clearly proud to advertise his specialisation, not least because of his royal appointment as animal painter to His Majesty George IV. There are also more specific ways in which London and its resources helped and inspired budding animal painters. London's busy network of carriages, horse riding, entertainments, the meat trade of Smithfield Market, and the ostentatious lifestyle of its elite inhabitants meant that it was a centre for the display of highly bred beasts and other animals, as Thomas Almaroth Williams has recently demonstrated. This gave opportunities to artists. The London-born Abraham Cooper, a horse and battle painter, taught himself to paint the equine performers at Astley's Circus in Lambeth, where he worked briefly for the manager, who was his uncle. While the Victorian equestrian portraitist Stephen Pearce grew up in the glamorous environment of the King's Mews at Charing Cross, where his father was master of the horse. The young Edwin Landseer, an animal painting prodigy who started exhibiting as a teenager, and his friend and next-door neighbour, John Frederick Lewis, later known as an Orientalist, but who started out as an animal painter, were also attracted by the vivid animal culture of the city. Both grew up in Marylebone in well-connected artistic families with engravers for fathers, and they seem to have encouraged each other in their enthusiasm for animal subjects, visiting menageries together. Landseer was also encouraged to dissect animals, including menagerie specimens, not by an animal painter, but by his mentor, Benjamin Robert Hayden, a history painter who believed animal anatomy gave crucial insight into human form and expression. As part of a professional and distinctly urban artistic class, it's interesting that animal painting appealed so strongly to these two young men, both seemingly attracted by the possibility of working on fresh, dynamic, and non-academic subjects that gave their work a new edge in a competitive marketplace. This talk is concentrated on London and art for public exhibition. It's only one aspect of animal and sporting painting, but the findings of this study, in terms of the wide appeal of animal subjects to a range of artists, the different routes into and the practices within the genre, and its integration with the art profession as a whole, seems to explode rather than draw together a coherent idea of animal painting as a trade. How then did its practitioners understand the genre? How did they learn the craft, its conventions, and what was required of them? It often seems to be assumed that successful animal painters had an innate talent or sympathy for depicting what they saw in front of them, but this isn't an entirely satisfactory way of thinking about the complex ways that art is created, the richness of its illusions, and how it resonates and appeals to its audience. Many animal painters, of course, though I found certainly not all, and not even a majority, learnt from other specialists in the field. A much less examined aspect, however, but one testified to in many biographical records, is the importance of learning from prints and drawings, both by contemporaries and, importantly, the old masters, especially the 17th century Dutch painters of landscapes with cattle, animal portraits, and dead game, whose work was extremely popular with British collectors in this period. I'd like to end by looking at a quite different kind of artist to Stubbs, whose biography reflects some of the things I've been talking about, the animal painter Charles Towne. Born in Wigan and based largely in Liverpool, where Stubbs was born, of course, he was self-taught, starting his career as a jobbing ornamental and coach painter. His decision to specialise in animal subjects was sparked by seeing and illicitly copying some of Stubbs's paintings at the 1787 exhibition of the Liverpool Society. And it was on this basis that he learnt to paint horses and was able to advertise his services as an animal portrait painter. His own skill and Stubbs as a model was enough to sustain Towne in local commissions in Liverpool and Manchester for the next decade. But he was both ambitious and embarrassed by his lack of formal training. In 1797, he travelled to London with the aim of improving as an artist, and it was only here, when comparing his work to what he saw around him, that he was prompted to study animal anatomy. That's after a decade of work. Another resource during his years in London and surrounding areas was the work of admired 17th century animal painters such as Weenix, Berkham and Cuyp, and this, I think, is crucial. Contemporary texts praised Towne for his descriptive skill and knowledge of animals and sports. It's usually the sort of thing you find written in contemporary texts about animal painters. But when we look at his work now, what's clear is how adaptable he was to reading the market for animal paintings and working within the models that were available to him. So here we have him looking at his contemporaries Stubbs, de Lutherberg, and Reinagel, as well as back to old masters such as Cuyp, Potter, and Berkham. And it's not all about slavish copying either. It's certainly not just about that. In this piece at Yale, the horses borrow heavily from Stubbs and Gilpin, but the highly finished detail, vivid animation of the figures, and their tense arrangement in an unending loop under a darkening sky makes for a small-scale but compelling artwork that rewards the viewer's repeated attention. The popular appeal at this time of this kind of artwork is intriguing and holds much further room for exploration. When we praise Stubbs and call him exceptional, unless we know what else was going on in the genre in which he was working, we won't fully know his contribution or his place. 18th and 19th century animal painting doesn't actually appear to have been a particularly demeaning specialisation, and it didn't have to be limiting. Plenty of animal painters, even ambitious ones, were keen to acknowledge their specialisation, and many other artists from diverse backgrounds were attracted to the genre. Much of this paper has concentrated on the period of the early 19th century, immediately after Stubbs's death, and his appealing and fresh portrayal of animals and his introduction of innovative new subjects, we can see in this exhibition, contributed much to the vivacity of the animal painting scene then. But there were many other artistic models that painters were also following. When looking outside the canon and into the complexity of the field of animal painting, we can learn more about everyday animal picturing, the evident importance of this market, and acknowledge the visual and possessive pleasures it supported, alongside the remarkable and exceptional works which stand out in art history books and which better fit our notions of art and taste. Thank you.